Good evening, participants. Welcome back to lecture number 3 of this 14-day lecture series on literature across continents. And today we will be discussing at depth the age of Enlightenment, the schools and movements that cropped up during that age. And we have among us Dr. Richa Jha, who I would like to take the honor and opportunity on behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE to introduce you to our resource person of the day, Dr. Richa Jha, who is an educationist, academician, and an author. Dr. Richa is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of English in St. Francis College, Bengaluru. She has authored Love and Marriage in Africa in the novels of Amadi, Buchi M. Chetta, and Chinua Achebe, along with several research papers dealing with African literature and feminist studies. She is deeply interested in socio-cultural issues, which is reflected in her writing, and also written and published poems that primarily deal with human emotions and relationships. A student at heart and a teacher by profession, she believes in eternal optimism and is passionate about life, travel, and literature. On behalf of Team DAATH VOYAGE, I welcome you. Thank you very much for sparing your valuable time, your energy in preparing the lecture. And, without wasting much time, the platform is all yours, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banerjee. Thank you. And good evening, all. I hope you find this lecture valuable and you gain something by the end of this session. Thank you so much, sir. So today we shall be dealing with the age of Enlightenment that happened to be in the 17th and 18th century. It was almost a global movement, not just confined to England. And we shall be taking up these subtopics along with the Age of Enlightenment, that is Commedia Del Arte, the Kit Kat Club, the Scribblers Club, Graveyard Poets, Gothic Literature, and Sturm und Drang. All of these were various movements and clubs that formed an integral part of this age. So the Age of Enlightenment was a great literary movement of the 17th and 18th century that dominated the literary, intellectual, and philosophical ideas, not only in England, but across the European continent. Since almost half the world, as we know, at that time was under the European colonists, so the reverberations of this movement could be felt across the globe. The ideas of the Enlightenment undermined the authority of the monarchy and the Catholic Church. And it also paved way for the political revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries. A variety of 19th century movements, including liberalism, communism, and neoclassicism, trace their intellectual heritage to the Enlightenment. Philosophers and scientists of the period widely circulated their ideas through meetings at scientific academies, Masonic lodges, literary salons, coffee houses, and in printed books, journals, and pamphlets. This was the time when there was a widespread literacy movement also, and the Tories were losing and the liberals were gaining ground at this time. This also led to a wide reading audience. This audience could read, they were literate or semi-literate, and therefore they wanted more and more material to read. So as a result, novels, periodicals, pamphlets, journals, and encyclopedias became the staple literary products of the time. In fact, the first encyclopedia by Diderot was brought about in this century itself, the 18th century. So this was the time when the Royal Society in London and such other societies across the continent propagated the wide advances in astronomy, mathematics, physics, mechanics, optics, and natural philosophy. These scientific advances made the general mind more open to rationality, and they began to wonder more openly about the hitherto forbidden knowledge. Till now, knowledge was just limited to the church or at the most the monarchy. But now the common public, they also wanted to know. Plus, there was also the scientific revolution that was happening in this time. So the general rise in literacy gave rise to large reading audience, as we said, and it also paved way for a large reading material. And the Age of Enlightenment was preceded and closely associated with the scientific revolution. While the English looked up to Isaac Newton's inventions and discoveries to pave the new enlightened path, the French philosophers began talking about individual liberty and religious tolerance in opposition to an absolute monarchy and fixed dogmas of the church. Italians discovered a new freedom and gender equality through their stage, and the whole Europe saw a new renaissance. Alexander's Pope's epitaph for the monument erected in the memory of Sir Isaac Newton in Westminster Abbey proclaims about the extraordinary virtue of the greatest scientist of the age. And he talks about how the nature had lay hidden the greatest gem of nature, because when God said that let Newton be, all was light. These lines not only talk about Pope's personal tribute to this gentleman who was the greatest scientist of his civilization of the time, but also show that how that time was given to intellectualism, reflection, and enlightenment. Coming out of the age of Cromwell, the strict Puritans, this age saw the rise in the scientific temperament, adherence to classical rules, religious toleration, rational Christianity based on common sense, virtuous thoughts and actions, and a perception of the nature of God through his creation rather than through revelation. There was less talk of magic and more of rational science and fact-based virtues. So earlier philosophers whose works influenced the Enlightenment include Francis Bacon and René Descartes. You must have heard of Francis Bacon and his essays, and René Descartes, who said that I am because I think, therefore I am. So the emphasis was laid on thought, on reason. And earlier philosophers like Descartes and Bacon, they influenced this Enlightenment movement. Some of the major figures of the Enlightenment include César Beccaria, Denis Diderot, the one I talked about writing the first encyclopedia of this time, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, the economist, Godfrey Wilhelm Leibniz, John Locke, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Adam Smith, another economist, Hugo Grotius, Baruch Spinoza, and Voltaire, some of the greatest thinkers of this time. One particularly influential Enlightenment publication, as we discussed, and because it is one of the most important ones, was the Encyclopedia. It was published between 1751 and 1772 in 35 volumes. It was compiled by Denis Diderot, Jean Leronde, and Alembert, and a team of 150 other intellectuals. The encyclopedia helped in spreading the ideas of Enlightenment across Europe and beyond. Other landmark publications of the Enlightenment included Voltaire's Letters on the English and the Dictionnaire Philosophique, Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature in 1740, Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, Rousseau's Discourse on Inequality and the Social Contract in 1762, Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, and The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in 1781 was also an important work of this time. Now, this idea of enlightenment, this was not just a literary property. This idea of enlightenment gave the scope for liberty. It led to the weakening of the monarchy and church. There was intellectual gratification and adherence to classicism, and this was deeply influential in the political realm as well, because we know how closely associated politics and church was before this time. So it led, as I said, to spread of literacy and education, and also brought about a political upheaval. European rulers such as Catherine II of Russia, Joseph II of Austria, and Frederick II of Prussia tried to apply this idea of enlightenment and this thought on their religious and political tolerance, which became known as enlightened absolutism. Many of the major political and intellectual figures behind the American Revolution associated themselves closely with the Enlightenment. You must have heard of Benjamin Franklin. Yes, the American revolutionist and president. He visited Europe repeatedly and contributed actively to the scientific and political debates there, and brought the newest ideas back to Philadelphia. Thomas Jefferson closely followed European ideas and later incorporated the same ideals into the American Declaration of Independence. And James Madison incorporated these ideals into the United States Constitution during its framing in 1787. The ideas of Enlightenment also played a major role in inspiring the French Revolution, which began in 1789. Once again, this 18th century, as we see, is very important, not only for the literature of the times that has continued to influence us till date, but also because of the political line that was set in that time, that again can be seen till date. The idea of liberty, the idea of equality, the idea of freedom, all of these had their echoes across the world. Be it the post-colonial times or even the present times, it is the same ideals that rule our political system till date. The art produced during the Enlightenment focused on a search for morality that was absent from the art in previous eras. If you remember, before just this Enlightenment was the time of the Restoration. And before that, the French court and all its mismannerisms, they had gained a lot of ground. Then came Cromwell with his Puritan thing. And then this Enlightenment. It focused on a search for morality that was absent in the earlier eras. At the same time, the classical art of Greece and Rome became interesting to people again. Since archaeological teams discovered Pompeii and Herculaneum, people took inspiration from it and revived classical art into neoclassical art. This can especially be seen in early American art and architecture, which featured arches, goddesses, and other classical architectural designs. Now, one of the basic and most important of the Enlightenment times, that was the age of freedom, prose, poetry, drama, and novels. Novels rose in this time as well. So there was the revival of the classical art, the classical poetry, and the drama and everything. Along with that, the novels also rose. And then we have the rise of the public sphere. One of the primary elements of the culture of Enlightenment was the rise of the public sphere. The realm of communication marked by new arenas of debate, more open and accessible forms of public space and sociability. An explosion of print culture. This was the time when pamphlets and journals and periodicals and novels, they were published and printed in large numbers, again to cater to the rising literacy in the people and their interest that had shifted to reading. In the late 17th and 18th century, elements of public sphere included that it was egalitarian, that it discussed the domain of common concern, and that argument was founded on reason. Habermas uses the term common concern to describe those areas of political, social knowledge and discussion that were previously the exclusive territory of the state and religious authorities. Now, it was open to critical examination by the public sphere. The values of this bourgeois public sphere included holding reason to the supreme, considering everything to be open to criticism. And since it was public, they could criticize everything. There was no fear that the church would intercede or that the monarchy would take them to task. And the opposition of secrecy of all sorts, that was another thing. Because it was public, everything was made public, everything was discussed vocally. So there was no secret. And the Kit Kat Club, the coffee houses, the salons, the Scribblers Club, the Masonic Lodges, etc., that we shall be discussing through this lecture, were examples of these public spheres of discourse. Now, we see that the common concern that was the basic primary concern of the people of this time who belonged to these clubs were not just concerned about literature, but they were also concerned about politics. In fact, some of these coffee houses and the clubs or the Masonic lodges were largely political in character. Also, this time saw the seeping in of sentimentality. As you must be aware, the 18th century is also known as the age of transition as well as the age of sentimentalism. This was the time when there was strict adherence to the classical rules by one section of the society, and at the same time, there were leeways made for romanticism and irrationality, so to say, because we see rise of the Gothic literature as well as the rise of the graveyard poets who were more bent towards the sentimental vein. So but now let's discuss about the rise of the public sphere. The rise of the public sphere has been associated with two long-term historical trends. That is the rise of the modern nation state and the rise of capitalism. Along with this, there is the Industrial Revolution as well. All of these things happened in this time. And because of these changes, like historical changes actually, we have the rise of the public sphere, because the public moved from their villages to the cities in order to work. Along with this movement came about new education, new literacy rates, and new intellectual growth as well. So the modern state, in its consolidation of public power, created by counterpoint a private realm of society independent of the state, which allowed for the public sphere. Capitalism also increased because of the industrialization. Society's autonomy and self-awareness also saw a rise, as well as an increasing need for the exchange of information. As the nascent public sphere extended, it embraced a large variety of institutions, and the most commonly cited were coffee houses and cafes, salons, and the literary public sphere, figuratively localized in the Republic of Letters. In France, the creation of the public sphere was helped by the aristocracy's move from the king's palace at Versailles to Paris in about 1720. Since their rich spending stimulated the trade in luxuries and artistic creations, especially fine paintings. The context for the rise of the public sphere was the economic and social change commonly associated with the Industrial Revolution. Economic expansion, increasing urbanization, rising population, and improving communications in comparison to the stagnation of the previous century. Rising efficiency in production techniques and communication lowered the prices of consumer goods and increased the amount and variety of goods available to consumers, including the literature essential to the public sphere. Meanwhile, the colonial experience, as I said, most European states had colonial empires in the 18th century. Those colonial experiences began to expose European society to extremely heterogeneous cultures, leading to the breaking down of barriers between cultural system, religious divides, gender differences, and geographical areas. The word public in itself implies the highest level of inclusivity. The public sphere, by definition, should be open to all. However, the sphere was only public to relative degree, and that is where we see towards the end of the Enlightenment, there is also a backlash to it, because Enlightenment thinkers frequently contrasted their conception of the public with that of the people. Because when you say that we are the public and we are thinking in this particular manner, you are automatically creating the other who is not thinking like you. So Condorcet contrasted opinion with populace. Marmontel, the opinion of men of letters with the opinion of the multitude. So these were the men of letters, and there was the men of multitude. They both had different opinions. And the Lambert, the truly enlightened public with the blind and noisy multitude. So there was the supremacy complex as well. Additionally, most institutions of the public sphere excluded both women and the lower classes. So there was exclusion. And we see how this exclusion was not adhered to in Commedia Del Arte, where we'll see that how, though people did not want women at that time to come on stage, still in Italy, when this movement rose, women took part in large numbers. So cross-cultural influences occurred through noble and lower class participation in areas such as the coffee houses and Masonic lodges. Because of the focus on reason over superstition, the Enlightenment cultivated the arts. Emphasis on learning, art, and music became more widespread, especially with the growing middle class. Areas of study such as literature, philosophy, science, and the fine arts increasingly explored subject matter to which the general public, in addition to the previously more segregated professionals and patrons, could relate. The increased consumption of reading materials of all sorts was one of the key features of the social enlightenment. As we talked about how the reading material, because there was just a demand and supply, because there was more demand, therefore there was more supply in this time. So that was one of the key features of the social enlightenment. Developments in the Industrial Revolution allowed consumer goods to be produced in great quantities and at a much lower price, encouraging the spread of books, pamphlets, newspapers, and journals, media of the transmission of ideas and attitudes. Commercial development likewise increased the demand for information. This is also known as reading revolution, along with rising population and increased urbanization. However, demand for reading material extended outside the realm of the commercial and outside the realm of the upper and middle class. It also stretched to the lower strata of the society. So this was a major change that underwent the 18th century. In particular, Rolf Engelsing has argued for the existence of a reading revolution, as I said. He talks of different types of reading in pre-Enlightenment and the Age of Enlightenment. Until 1750, reading was done intensively. People tended to own a small number of books and read them repeatedly, often to a small audience. After 1750, people began to read extensively, finding as many books as they could, increasingly reading them alone. This is supported by increasing literacy rates, especially among women. The vast majority of the reading public could not afford to own a private library. And while most of the state-run universal libraries set up the 17th and 18th centuries were open to the public, they were not the only sources of reading material. Periodicals of the time printed poems, novels, and essays, etc., in their editions to cater to a largely rural and semi-literate audience. While there was original work published, there were also retellings of medieval romances and condensed versions of popular novels, among other things. Moving up the classes, a variety of institutions offered readers access to reading material without needing to buy anything. Libraries that lent out their material for a small price started to appear, and occasionally bookstores would offer a small lending library to their patrons. Coffee houses commonly offered books, journals, and sometimes even popular novels to their customers. The Tatler and the Spectator, two influential periodicals of this time, sold from 1709 to 1714. And these two were closely associated with coffee house culture in London, being both read and produced in various establishments in the city. This is an example of the triple or even quadruple function of the coffee house. Reading material was often obtained, read, discussed, and even produced on the premises. The first scientific and literary journals were established during the Enlightenment. Although the existence of dictionaries and encyclopedias spanned into ancient times, the text changed from simply defining words in long-running lists to a far more detailed discussions of those words in the 18th century encyclopedic dictionaries. The works were part of an Enlightenment movement to systematize knowledge and provide education to a wider audience than the elite. As the 18th century progressed, a content of encyclopedias also changed according to readers' tastes. Volumes tended to focus more strongly on secular affairs, particularly science and technology, rather than matters of theology, which was up till now the major focus of all literature work. The 18th century Age of Enlightenment saw the development of the modern novel. This is one of the major progress that this time made. Novel as a literary genre. In fact, many candidates for the first novel in English date for this period, of which Daniel Defoe's 1719 Robinson Crusoe is probably the best known. We also have Pamela, or the Virtue Rewarded, of this time. The subgenres of novel during the 18th century were the epistolary novel, the sentimental novel, histories, Gothic, and the libertine novels. The 18th century Europe started in the Age of Enlightenment and gradually moved towards Romanticism. And in the visual arts, it was the period of Neoclassicism. The clash of ideas between the classical and the romantics, the Whigs and the Tories, the rationalists and the sentimentalists all started in public spheres that have come to define the age of enlightenment. Now let us look at these hubs before we continue with the discussion about our subtopics for the day. Salons. These are the first spaces of the public sphere that we've taken up. Salons were places where philosophers united. They discussed old, actual, or new ideas. This led to salons being the birthplace of intellectual and enlightened ideas. Now, very similar to salons were also the coffee houses. Now, just like salons, here also people united and they shared ideas, but the major difference was that while salons were limited to philosophers and the elite people of that age, coffee houses were more general in nature. So people from different walks of life gathered and shared ideas there. They need not be of the same class, of the same place, but they all could come there and talk out their own opinions. So coffee houses were especially important to the spread of knowledge during the Enlightenment because they created a unique environment in which people from many different walks of life gathered and shared ideas. They were frequently criticized by nobles who feared that the possibility of an environment in which class and its accompanying titles and privileges were disregarded, such a thing could overturn their power. Such an environment was especially intimidating to monarchs, who derived much of their power from the disparity between classes of people. If classes were to join together under the influence of the Enlightenment thinking, they might recognize the all-encompassing oppression and abuses of their monarchs, and because of their size, might be able to carry out successful revolts. Monarchs also resented the idea of their subjects convening as one to discuss political matters. Because as I told you earlier, coffee houses were the hubs, not only for literary discussion, but also very much political in nature, especially those concerning foreign affairs. Rulers thought political affairs to be their business only, a result of their supposed divine right to rule. Coffee shops became homes away from home for many who sought to engage in discourse with their neighbors and discuss intriguing and thought-provoking matters, especially those regarding philosophy to politics. Coffee houses were essential to the Enlightenment, for they were centers of free thinking and self-discovery. This is the place where people from different backgrounds, from different strata of society, from different cultures came together. And we talked about how the Spectator perhaps was born in one such coffee house. So although many coffee house patrons were scholars, a great deal were not. As I said, there were different people from different strata coming together in these coffee houses. They attracted a diverse set of people, including not only the educated wealthy, but also members of the bourgeois and the lower class. While it may seem positive that patrons, being doctors, lawyers, merchants, etc., represented almost all classes, the coffee shop environment sparked fear in those who sought to preserve class distinction. So there will always be detractors, there will always be supporters, and such was the case with these coffee houses as well. There were people who enjoyed coming together, bringing together people from different class, from different sectors, and then there were people who felt that their monopoly would be disrupted if people from all class came together. Excuse me. One of the most popular critiques of the coffee houses claimed that it allowed promiscuous association among people from different rungs of the social ladder. So see, the use promiscuous, that is so negative in character. And from the artisan to the aristocrat, they all came together in the coffee houses. This unique culture served as a catalyst for journalism, where Joseph Addison and Richard Steele recognized its potential as audience. And here, people from everywhere came together, very much like Noah's Ark. That's a comparison that has been made in a positive sense as well, Because just like the Noah's Ark received all people when the great flood came, whoever could manage to come till the boat, similarly here also, people from all walks of life could come and join the coffee houses and join the discussion, which was open to all. So together, Steele and Addison, that is Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, they recognized its potential, and together they published the Spectator in 1711. It was a daily publication which aimed through fictional narrator of Mr. Spectator both to entertain and to provoke discussion regarding serious philosophical matters. The first English coffee houses opened in Oxford in 1650. Brian Cowan said that Oxford coffee houses developed into penny universities, offering a locus of learning that was less formal than structured institutions, but learning nevertheless. These penny universities occupied a significant position in Oxford academic life, as they were frequented by those consequently referred to as the virtuosi who conducted their research on some of the resulting premises. According to Cowan, the coffee house was a place for like-minded scholars to congregate, to read, as well as learn from and to debate with each other, but was emphatically not a university institution, and the discourse could range from any topic to any topic. In fact, the Café Procope in Paris was one such coffee house where Diderot and D'Alembert decided to create the encyclopedia. So we have much to owe to these coffee houses. And now let's take a look at another important public meeting group named by the people as Masonic Lodges, referring to the lodge-like place where this group met. So Masonic Lodges, they were, during the Enlightenment, an international network of like-minded men. And they were also called as Freemasons. They comprised an international network of like-minded men, often meeting in secret in ritualistic programs at their lodges or their boardings. They promoted the ideals of the Enlightenment and helped diffuse these values across Britain and France and other places. Now, one of the major differences between this Masonic lodges and the coffee houses was again the people who attended. Now, while coffee house was totally out in the open, ready to invite and take in everyone and anyone who came, this one, the Masonic Lodge, was more about like-minded people coming together. And these were people who held one ideal dear to their hearts, similar ideals, that is. They promoted the ideals of enlightenment, and they did not just stop in that lodge, but they diffused this idea across the continent and even further on. So Freemasonry, as a systematic creed with its own myths, values, and sets of rituals, originated in Scotland around 1600 and spread first to England and then across the continent in the 18th century. They fostered new codes of conduct, including a communal understanding of liberty and equality inherited from guild sociability, liberty, fraternity, and equality. If you remember the French Revolution, this was the slogan, liberty, fraternity, and equality. It also found its root in these Masonic lodges. Historians have debated the extent to which the secret network of Freemasonry was a main factor in the Enlightenment. The leaders of the Enlightenment included Freemasons such as Diderot, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Lessing, Pope, Horace Walpole, Sir Robert Walpole, who was Horace Walpole's father, Mozart, the great musician, Goethe, Frederick the Great, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington. Norman Davies said that Freemasonry was a powerful force on behalf of liberalism in Europe from about 1700 to the 20th century. It expanded rapidly during the Age of Enlightenment, reaching practically every country in Europe. It was especially attractive to powerful aristocrats and politicians, as well as intellectuals, artists, and political activists. So they had a very, very strong hold in the political structure as well as the literary structure that spread across continents. So they must have been a very, very powerful group. And next we have the debating society. This was another example of the public sphere during the Enlightenment. Their main concern, however, was religious. While the Freemasons were more political in nature, the coffee houses were more literary in their nature, the debating society's concern was mainly religious. So everything previously rooted in tradition was questioned and often replaced by new concepts in the light of philosophical reason. Their origins include clubs of 50 or more men who at the beginning of the 18th century met in pubs to discuss religious issues and affairs of the state. Mooting clubs set up by law students to practice rhetoric. The moot clubs where you enact characters, where you take up cases. If you've read Vijay Tendulkar's Silence, the Court is in Session, then there is this whole description of a moot court. Spouting clubs established to help actors train for theatrical roles. John Henley's oratory, which mixed outrageous sermons with even more absurd questions like whether Scotland be anywhere in the world. So is it like even relevant today to think of those? But at that time, that was a big debating culture to even discuss such non-issues, and proper societies were formed for this. In addition to debates on religion, societies, these societies discussed issues such as politics and also the role of women. So in the late 1770s, popular debating societies began to move into more genteel rooms, a change which helped establish a new standard of sociability. The backdrop to these developments was an explosion of interest in the theory and practice of public elocution. Excuse me. The debating societies were commercial enterprises that responded to this demand, sometimes very successfully. Some societies welcomed 800 to 1200 spectators a night. So they were large societies, had a great fan following. The debating societies discussed an extremely wide range of topics. Before the Enlightenment, most intellectual debates revolved around confessional, that is, Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, or Anglican issues, and the main aim of these debates was to establish which block of faith ought to have the monopoly of truth and a God-given title to authority. However, afterwards, everything that was previously rooted in tradition was questioned and often replaced by new concepts in the light of philosophical reason. After the second half of the 17th century and during the 18th century, a general process of rationalization and secularization set in, and confessional disputes were reduced to a secondary status in favor of the escalating contest between faith and incredulity. If you remember, this was also the age of much scientific advancement. And so at this time, another topic, apart from which religion was, or which church, which sector of the church was more powerful, the whole debate shifted between faith and disbelief. Was there even faith alive or not, because of the growing rationalism? In addition to these debates on religion, societies discussed issues such as politics and the role of women. However, it is important to note that the critical subject matter of these debates did not necessarily translate into opposition to the government. So this wasn't, as the Freemasons, as the Masonic lodges, this wasn't much political in nature, and therefore it did not necessarily translate against the government. In other words, the results of the debate quite frequently upheld the status quo, that what is, exists, and that is the best state. From a historical standpoint, one of the most important features of the debating society was their openness to the public. As women attended and even participated in almost every debating society, which were likewise open to all classes, providing they could pay the entrance fee. Once inside, spectators were able to participate in largely egalitarian form of sociability that helped spread Enlightenment ideas. So the rule of the public sphere in the 18th century formed an integral part of this time. And there were various discussions, various societies, all of them involved in literature as well as politics of the time. And moving on, let's focus on the literary trends of the age. Let us begin with the light-hearted comedy, the Commedia Del Arte, which has its roots in Italy. So it had its root in the Italian professional theater. So Commedia dell'arte that flourished in the 16th and 18th century, it literally meant comedy of the profession. It was an early form of professional theater that originated in Italy and then became popular across Europe. It was formerly called Italian comedy in English. Though first seen in Italian mannerisms, that was in the 16th century, it gained once again its ground in the 18th century, which was also the age of Renaissance once again. So, characterized by masked types, Commedia was responsible for the rise of actresses such as Isabella Andrini and improvised performances based on sketches or scenarios. So there was these typical stock characters, and there were comedies that were performed with masks, and these masks were common throughout a different plays, and these were stock characters like the old man and the young lovers and the servant, and there was also the basic plot that mostly remained the same. So Commedia, such as the Tooth Puller, is both scripted and improvised. So there was a written script, but of course, according to the audience, according to the mood of the situation, the characters could also improvise on their dialogues. The characters' entrances and exits were scripted. A special characteristic of Commedia is the lazo, a joke or something foolish or witty, usually well known to the performers and to some extent a scripted routine. Another characteristic of Commedia is pantomime, which is mostly used by the character Arlecchino. Now we know him better as the Harlequin, the colorful comic actor, basically. So the first recorded Commedia dell'arte performances came from Rome as early as 1551. So this was a trend that continued from the 16th till the 18th century and even further on. And it was performed outdoors in temporary venues by professional actors who were costumed and masked. So, as I said, the people who acted in these comedies, they usually had fixed types. They were stock characters. So although Commedia dell'arte flourished in Italy during the Mannerist period, that was the 16th century, there has been a long-standing tradition of trying to establish historical antecedents in antiquity. Because this was the time, the 18th century was the time when people wanted to return to the classics, the classic time. Therefore, there was one section that wanted to return to the classic times, the Neoclassicist, and then there was the other who wanted to break free. So the Neoclassicist, looking at the popularity of Commedia dell'arte, would not want to accede to it being a new form, and therefore they wanted to establish its historical connection. While it is possible to detect formal similarities between Commedia dell'arte and earlier theatrical traditions, there is no way to establish certainty of origin. We can't say for sure. Some date the origins to the period of the Roman Republic, the Plotine types, the time of Pluto, or the empire, the Attilan farces. Now, this was the time that featured crude types wearing masks, that is the Attilan farces during the Roman Empire. So that mask is supposed to be the same mask that has been incorporated in the Commedia dell'arte by these people who are the Neoclassicists, who want to establish this connection, basically. So the Attilan farces of the Roman Empire featured crude types wearing masks with grossly exaggerated features and an improvised plot. Some historians argue that Attilan stock characters, Papus, that is Macus or Bacchus, and Mandicus, are the primitive versions of the Commedia characters, Pantalone, Pulcinella, and Il Capitano. So these are the stock characters that were there in Italian Commedia dell'arte. We shall also see how it has influenced or has its reverberance in the English literature. More recent accounts establish links to the medieval wrongdoers and prototypes from medieval moralities, such as Harlequin, and which was known as Harlequin in Italy. The first recorded Commedia dell'arte performance came from Rome as early as 1551, as I said, and it was performed outdoors in temporary venues. There were no fixed stage like the amphitheater or the globe. It was a moving stage. Because it was performed outdoors from one venue to the other, where professional actors were costumed and masked, as opposed to Commedia erudita, which were written comedies presented indoors by untrained and unmasked actors. So there is this fine line between Commedia dell'arte and Commedia erudita, which was also another type of comedy that preceded this time. Now, another important thing that I talked about was in these times, it was not just the script that was followed, but there were also improvised dialogues that these characters could deliver on their own. The characters of Commedia usually represent fixed social types and stock characters such as foolish old men, young upper class lovers, devious servants, or military officers full of false bravado. It originated in Italy, traveled far and wide. Female characters acted on stage, a change from men playing female roles. So if you remember the Shakespearean comedies, the English comedies, at that time, it were the male actors that also performed the female roles. But here, Italy moved ahead in its Enlightenment in the case of equality, gender equality, so to say, where the women also started playing their own roles. And it largely inspired the Punch and Judy puppet shows in England. Now, the Commedia dell'arte has 4 stock character groups: the Zani, the servants basically, and who are also known as the Allacino, and as you see here on screen. And each of these characters had distinct costumes as well, like the Arlecchino or the Harlequin. If you've seen, if you've read, what do you call it? If you've read The Heart of Matter, there you have the Harlequin and how he wears colorful clothes at all times. So that is one of the things that, because they'll be always joking and they'll be colorful in their apparel as well. So that was the Arlecchino, also known as the Harlequin. These were typically servants. And sometimes they were servants to 2 masters. And that is where the comedy arose. Like, for example, one master would ask them to do one thing and then they would forget who asked them to do what. And there the comedy would arise. And they used to wear colorful, tight-fitting jackets and trousers. Then the Pulcinella. This was again, another servant or master, and they would generally wear baggy white outfit. The Il Dottore was always the head of the household, and he would be all like full of gravity and wear black scholarly robe because he's the master of the house. Then Il Capitano or La Signora. So that is the indigent loner, and he would always be in a military uniform, this typical stock character. And these people, they were also braggarts at time, or they could also be a female, these actors. Of course, the female would not wear military uniform, but she would also be well dressed and smartly dressed. The innamorati would be high class, hopeless lovers, and they would typically have names like Flavio or Isabella, like such really romantic names and sweet names, and they would be always nicely dressed, on par with the time, like fashionable with the times. And then there was the Pantalone. Now, Pantalone was again the wealthy old man. He would always be the older wealthy man, and he would also be nicely dressed, and he would wear dark capes and red trousers. So, and mostly these older men would try to behave younger to their age, perhaps even try to woo the heroine. Again, another situational comedy would arise from their attempts. Then the Tartaglia. This was the stuttering statesman. Large felt hat, enormous cloak. They would be the stuttering statesman, that is, they hold a high position in the society, but their character does not really do justice to their position. Then the Columbina would be the always the perky maid or servant. Just like Arlecchino would be the male servant, Columbina would be the perky maid servant. And she would also be colorfully dressed on par with Arlecchino or black and white. So depending on her role, whether she would be matched with Arlecchino, romantically involved, then she would also be wearing colorful clothes or not. Then Piero would again be a sad clown. Okay, not everyone can be boisterous. Even comedy needs some comic relief. And there would be this Piero, who would be a sad clown, a servant, with his white flowy costume with large buttons. White showing his maturity, he's sad because he knows the world better, right? So the characters of the Commedia usually represent fixed social types and stock characters, such as foolish old men, devious servants, or military officers full of false bravado. These characters are exaggerated real characters, such as a know-it-all doctor. He would always be called Il Dottore, or a greedy old man called Pantalone, or a perfect relationship like what the Innamorati would have, the hopeless lovers. And it was always performed outside on platforms or in popular areas such as the piazza. Piazza was the town square in Italy. This form of theater originated in Italy but traveled throughout Europe, sometimes to as far as Moscow. Generally, the actors playing were diverse in background in terms of class and religion. And they belonged to diverse times, and they had very, very conventional plots as well, as I said, because they were stock characters, and therefore the plot was also taken from the old stock mostly. So these stock characters were exaggerated real characters, and the popularity was such that it went throughout Europe, and we'll see how it influenced the English stage as well, and sometimes to as far as Moscow. Generally, the actors playing were diverse in background in terms of class and religion and performed anywhere they could. Castaño posits that the aesthetic of exaggeration, distortion, anti-humanism as in the masked types, and excessive borrowing as opposed to originality was typical of all arts in the late Italian Renaissance. Theatre historian Martin Green points to the extravagance of emotion during the period of Commedia's emergence as the reason for representational moods or characters that define the art. In Commedia, each character embodies a mood: mockery, sadness, gaiety, confusion, and so forth. And their character, their dialogues, everything revolves around their mood. According to the 18th century London theatre critic Baretti, Commedia dell'arte incorporates specific roles and characters that were originally intended as a kind of characteristic representative of some popular Italian district or town. So they were like archetypes. The character's persona included the specific dialect of the region or town represented, meaning that on stage, each character was performed in its own dialect. Now, that could be very, very interesting, as well as quite difficult to understand for a person belonging to a different region. However, characters would often be passed down from generation to generation, and characters married on stage were often married in real life as well, seen most famously with Francesco and Isabella Andrini. So of course, they have been working together generation after generation, and these people have stayed together. So obviously they would start relationship together. This was believed to make performances more natural, as well as strengthening the bonds within the troupe, who emphasized complete unity even between every member. Additionally, each character has a singular costume and mask that is representative of the character's role, as we saw in the table above. During the Napoleonic occupation of Italy, instigators of reform and critics of French imperial rule, such as Giacomo Casanova, used the carnival masks to hide their identities while fueling political agendas. So if you see that how in the 18th century, political agenda is never devoid or distinct from the art form that is practiced with the age. We all know that literature is mirror of the society, and what better way to propagate ideas, political or theological, than through literature. However, when these ideas were fueled against Napoleon, challenging social rule and hurling blatant insults and criticisms at the regime, in 1797, in order to destroy the impromptu style of carnival as partisan platform, Napoleon outlawed the Commedia del Arte. It was not reborn in Venice until 1979 because of this law that Napoleon passed. And however, we have the reflection of Commedia del Arte in our own, not our own, but the English literature as well, in the Comedy of Manners, where again we'll see how there are typical conventional plot lines as well as typical stock characters, and most of these characters will have typical costumes. So the conventional plot lines of Commedia del Arte were written on themes of sex, jealousy, love, old age, and love could be either requited or not. But mostly these stories had these plays had happy ending. So the one-sided lover would have definitely the old-aged lover would remain with his unrequited love, but the main enumerati would always find love with each other, the main characters basically. Many of the basic plot elements can be traced back to the Roman comedies of Plautus and Terence, some of which were themselves translation of lost Greek comedies of the 4th century BC. However, it is more probable that the comici used contemporary novella or traditional sources as well, and drew from current events and local news of the day. Not all scenarios were comic. There were some mixed forms and even tragedies. Shakespeare's The Tempest is drawn from a popular scenario in the Scala collection. His Polonius in Hamlet is drawn from Pantalone, and his clowns bear homage to the Zanini. The classic traditional plot is that the innumerati are in love and wish to be married, but one elder vecchio or several elders vecchi are preventing this from happening, leading the lovers to ask one or more zani, or that is the eccentric servants, for help. Typically, the story ends happily, with the marriage of the innumerati and forgiveness for any wrongdoings. There are countless variations on the story, as well as many that diverge wholly from the structure, such as the well-known story about Arlecchino or the Harlequin, and how he becomes mysteriously pregnant, being a man. That was one of the comic element of the time, or the Punch and Judy scenario. The works of a number of playwrights have featured characters influenced by the Commedia dell'arte and sometimes directly draw from it. Prominent examples include The Tempest by William Shakespeare, Les Fourberies de Scapin by Molière, Servant of Two Masters, 1743 by Carlo Goldini, The Figaro Plays by Pierre Bourg-Marquez, and especially Love for Three Oranges, Turandot, and Other Faibles by Carlo Gozzi. Influences appear in the lodgers in Stephen Berkoff's adaptation of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. And then we also see how Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis in turn inspired George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion. So the Commedia dell'arte maybe started in the 15th, 16th century, but its effect can be seen even in the 20th century. Now, it also is credited with inspiring the comedy of manners, a genre of satirical comedy of the Restoration period, 1660 to 1710, that questions and comments upon the manners and social conventions of a greatly sophisticated and artificial society. It influenced this comedy of manners, and it is said that the comedy of manners and Commedia dell'arte are similar because both of them use stock characters such as fops, country bumpkins, elegant young ladies and older persons attempting to recapture their youth. The presence of at least one pair of young lovers is compulsory in both these forms of plays. And then there is gossips and common intrigues and satire on manners and affectations of the contemporary society. That is again a common theme in both the comedies, and of course a happy and cheerful ending. So the Comedy of Manners was supposed to be influenced by Commedia del Arte to some extent. And sorry, just a second. And this was, and it's also said that the Comedy of Manners also had its origin to the to the dated of ancient Greek playwright Menander, and his plays displayed stereotypical behavior of a social class, often represented by stock characters, and this is where they were similar. And then the Comedy of Manners, who were the greatest playwrights of this time, William Congreve, and then William Wycherley and George Etheridge, Shakespeare, of course. All of these were real great dramatists of this time. So to sum it up, the Commedia dell'arte was an Italian dramatic movement that emerged in the first European Renaissance of the 16th century, but continued to influence playwrights like Shakespeare, George Etheridge, Sheridan, Molière, Kafka, Shaw, William Congreve, William Wycherley, etc. down the ages.